which is the petition of Rutland Renewable Energy LLC for a certificate of public good pursuant to 30 VSA section 248, authorizing the construction and operation of the Cold River project, consisting of up to a 2.3 megawatt solar electric generation facility to be located at the intersection of Cold River Road and Stratton Road in the town of Rutland, Vermont. I'd like to start by taking notice of the hearing.
Aaron Kasicki on behalf of the Department of Public Service.
Don Einhorn for the Natural Resources Agency.
Alan George on behalf of the neighbors.
Kevin Brown for the town of Rutland.
Kimberly, oh, I'm sorry. Kimberly Payton and Danielle Chagall of Town Council for petitioning. And with us is Georgiana Chesterton from Pro Solar and Roger Rose from Pro Solar.
Okay, thank you. We're here for oral argument. I guess the folks who requested oral argument were the neighbors and the town. So I guess have you folks between the town and the neighbors, if you would like to go first.
You want me to go first? I've been invited to go first.
Okay.
I know the neighbors are going to focus on the ag soils issue, so I must probably not give that great attention. The town, I'm sorry. Did I say the neighbors? The town. I wish to make an inquiry first. Will the board undertake a site visit, or has that decision not yet been made?
I don't think it's been made yet. If we do, we'll send out a notice.
If you're familiar with the case generally, and I don't know that you've actually looked at testimony and exhibits and
Read these
transcripts,
D for D, and we read your comments on it.
and that's the extent of it. I would suggest that if you do not do a site visit, that you at least examine the photography that's at the back of Gene Vissering's exhibit. It's JV2, and it has photography from each of the houses that are represented by my clients in this matter. This project is to be located on the floor of a small valley. It is a meadow, basically, under current circumstances. It's not in agricultural use currently, and hasn't been for a number of years. It is surrounded by residential properties that have, several of which have unobstructed views of the whole project once it is developed. They will see it, unavoidably see all of it. Two of those properties are historic structures. One of them is the property of Charles Flanders, who is present here with me today, sitting at the last seat. Another property that is involved here, a neighbor's property that is viewed from a somewhat greater distance, is David Fuchsi's. He's sitting there also. A second historic structure is owned by the Romeo family, and both the Romeo property and the Flanders property look directly into this project. A non-historic property which has a direct view unobstructed of this project is to the north. It is owned by the Carrera Trust and occupied by the Robert Carrera family.
Mr. George, could I inquire, when you say historic, would you help define that for us? There's a lot of use of the term.
Yeah.
And does that mean it's on a register? Could you explain
It's
what
on
you
the
mean
re-
when you say that?
It's on the Vermont Register of Historic Sites,
Thank you.
both of those properties. The properties as described will be directly, as I've indicated, in full view of this project if it is in fact developed. Another element of this case, or an element of this case, that ought to be taken into some consideration is I believe it is a case of first impression in the sense that I believe this is the first time a town has actually adopted a supporting plan or any other mechanism by which to specifically address solar siting, facility siting, and in this instance, we're dealing with the town of Rutland's solar facility siting standards. And I don't believe this board has previously seen such a direct application of a local rule to projects of this type, to a solar facility project. First criterion that we're addressing here today is that of orderly development. One of the things I want to call your attention to is that the proposal for decision really seems to just treat the issue as one of conformity with the town plan. It's as if Section 248 B5 incorporates criterion 10 of Act 250. It does not. We're rather dealing with the question of whether or not the project will interfere with the orderly development of the region. And the board is directed by statute to take into account the recommendations of the municipal and regional planning commission, if any, the local legislative body, in this instance, the town of Rutland Select Board, and consider their recommendations on whether or not the project interferes with the orderly development of the region or the community. The town plan, 2009 Rutland Town Plan, did not contemplate a project like this one. The hearing officer finds that it encourages the development of renewable resources. Yes, it does, in about a paragraph. There are relatively few words spoken about renewable energy, and they include such things, frankly, as encourage the development of renewable energy is something that the hearing officer cites. The town plan also says support a reduction in energy consumption by individuals, businesses, and municipal operations, and reduce the amount of travel conducted by single occupant vehicles. This is hardly an endorsement of a solar project of this size. This project will consume all of the developable area of that meadow, 15 acres. There will be approximately 10,000 solar panels, one or possibly two inverters enclosed in fairly substantial structures, transformers, real development. Hardly a topic addressed in 2009 Rutland Town Plan. The hearing officer said in his proposal for decision that there are two basic grounds. One, as I've indicated, is this notion that the town plan encourages the development of renewable resources. The second is that the project designates this site as an industrial commercial site. We had quite a bit of go around on this in the course of the hearings. And frankly, none of it really has tremendous relevance. I don't think that the town plan or the future land use map that's attached to it that has this so-called designation are in any sense controlling on the question of orderly development. The zoning, there is no zoning in the town of Rutland. The future land use maps boundaries are antiquated. They don't even include all of what is now the town of Rutland. The map is old, it specifically indicates that on the legend. It was developed in 2004. I think it's now been revised. It includes, as industrial, commercial property, entire reaches of the town, right to the banks of the Otter Creek. In this instance, there's a conservation district that adjoins this property. Conservation district consists of wetland, class 2 wetland. That class 2 wetland actually bleeds into this site. There's a straight line indicating this boundary. It's not a contour or map that shows precisely what is conservation district and what isn't. It's crudely developed. I don't think it's worth a lot of attention from the board, but nevertheless, I think it was important to point those factors out. The hearing officer also had questions regarding such things as the agricultural soils, which Mr. Brown will address. The possibility that the property could be developed for housing rather than for solar, and that if it's developed for housing, the agricultural potential would be reduced relative to the possibility that after a period of 25 years or so, this solar project would return to be fallow ground that could arguably once again be used agriculturally. The fact that the town plan doesn't specify or restrict the development of this property for either housing or for agriculture or for any other specific purpose is obviously because it is only a town plan, a non-regulatory device. Restrictions on development and preferences, conditional uses and all of that sort of thing are accomplished through zoning, not through town plans. So there is, I think, no surprise that the town plan does not direct us to a sense as to what is and what is not acceptable for orderly development of that, of the area. On the subject of aesthetics, I think, of course, the Act 99 of the 2014 legislative session directs you in Section 4 to apply the standards of the Thomas Hellman case in Supreme, as enunciated in the Supreme Court, to net meter projects in the future. I point out in our exceptions and brief that really, when we look at the Hellman case that was decided by this board, actually I think only Commissioner Burt was a member of the board at the time of the Hellman decision. It was a 10 kilowatt relevance, even though it wasn't controlling in any way in the case, but it was deemed to be relevant as a written community standard. The board also found that from a neighboring property's perspective, the project's appearance was shocking and offensive, and not from the public perspective, but rather from a neighbor's perspective, and concluded that mitigation was not appropriate, was not appropriately considered and engaged by the developer in that case. The Hellman decision of the Supreme Court follows the Creechy case and specifies that in the second prong, the three issues are: does the project violate a clear written community standard intended to preserve scenic or natural beauty of the area? 2, does the project offend the sensibilities of the average person? And 3, have the applicants fail to take generally available mitigating steps that a reasonable person would take to improve the harmony of the proposed project with the surroundings. These are precisely the things, of course, that were considered carefully by this board in the Hellman case. On the issue of a clear written community standard, we contend that the solar facility siting standards meet that standard. The hearing officer basically agrees, but nevertheless determines not to follow the standards that are included in the facility siting standards because he deems them, particularly the setbacks, to be de facto zoning bylaws. And of course, this board is not required to follow the strictures of local zoning. The fact is they are not zoning bylaws. The fact is that any time you would try to articulate a standard that would be used for guidance in the development of a project, you're going to have expressed yourself in such a manner that as you would if you were stating the substance of a zoning bylaw. How else can you state a standard for development except in some manner that might also be interpreted as sounding like a zoning bylaw? Fact is, they are not zoning bylaws. They are rather standards to guide the development of the project, of any project in the town. The hearing officer also contended that to the extent that the solar facility siting standard should be adopted and accepted by this board, they should only be permitted to the extent that they are consistent with the town plan. Again, the town plan becomes the governing document. In this instance, we know the town plan in 2009 was basically antiquated by the time this project came forward, and that the solar facility siting standards were very specifically adopted to address issues of the kind that are presented in this case. I want to talk about the shocking and offensive characterization. This board, in recent decisions over the last couple of years, distinguishes the neighbor's view from as an individualized perspective, which by definition is different than the viewpoint of the average person. I have great difficulty understanding how that could possibly be. In the Hellman case, the board specifically said the project will be offensive and shocking to them, that being the Ramonos, or these neighbors, from their home, and to the average person in a similar situation. Based upon our site visit to the area, we concur with the hearing officer's conclusion that the project in its presently proposed location will offend the sensibilities of the average person faced with a similar situation, that is, from the perspective of that home. That's the way the board did this. That's the way the Queechee case suggests it be done. That's the way the Hellman case in the Supreme Court affirms what the board did below in Hellman. That's the way it ought to be done. It should not be troubling for this board or its hearing officers to go on to a neighbor's property and view the project site and make a determination as to whether or not the project's impact aesthetically will be shocking or offensive. There's no reason in the world not to discount the neighbor's position to the extent that neighbors are likely to say, not in my backyard, in this instance, not in my front yard. And to find that they are more sensitive than the average person in the traveling public project's aesthetic impacts. However, the mere fact that they have that inclination is something that you would automatically discount. You ought to be able to go onto a site and say to yourself, this is terrible. This is horrible. This is something that these people will face 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the life of the project. And that's unacceptable, if indeed it is. And I think if you do a site visit, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. The issue of mitigation. I find it interesting that mitigation is always listed in Public Service Board cases as the second element of the second prong. Look first to community standards, written community standards, and then to mitigation, and then finally to shocking or offensive. I think you've got it upside down. The way the environmental district commissions and formerly the board and now the environmental court examine these issues is to consider the written standards, the relative shock or offensiveness of the project may not be so overwhelming that the decision makers should find that the project therefore has an undue adverse aesthetic impact. But nevertheless, it may suggest that there are ways to mitigate and to reduce the impact of that otherwise shocking impact. And the ways to do that might be with additional vegetative screening, with planting. In this instance, we have setbacks that are proposed in the solar siting standards that are really probably nonsensical to some extent. They were 200 feet for a project of 1.5 kilowatts or larger. Here we can deal with a setback of 200 feet for a 2.3 megawatt project that will occupy 15 acres of land with an uninterrupted array of electrical equipment and panels. And 10,000 panels is a considerable impact on that view. You have to excuse me, I've got a little bit of a dryness and it's affecting my voice.
You said the setbacks in the standards to some extent are nonsensical.
Well,
Much smaller, if you meant for the much smaller ones contemplated, but not for this.
yes, I think probably when they were developed, I don't think that the people who were authoring the standards really understood how large and how small 1 kilowatt is versus 1 megawatt or more.
So what you're saying is basically just related to the size of the projects that were conventional.
Right, that's how those standards are, a sliding scale in the standards. And I guess my point is that when you look at this project, and it's 2.3 megawatts, the 200-foot setback requirement from the road, the 500-foot setback requirement from an historic property is not terrible, not unreasonable on its face. The real problem with this site, I believe, is the site selection itself. The site had no room to provide mitigation, no room to make any accommodation in mitigation to surrounding properties that are elevated above the project and you look right onto it. If there were even just 100-foot setback, possibly they could be planting cedars or other conifers that would provide, in time, enough height to make the project substantially invisible, to effectively screen it for the most part. I don't think it could ever be screened in such a manner that it would actually be unviewable, but it could be screened so as to break it up and soften the impact of viewing. There's no consideration in the proposal for decision of anything other than either it's 200 feet or nothing. And the hearing officer concludes it should be nothing. We don't think that's fair and reasonable. We think that when you look at this project, you might have found that by reducing its size, which our expert Gene Bissering suggested, by reducing its size, you can provide some softening of the impact of the project. As things stand, developers make the decision as to what's going to be involved in any future litigation. If, as in this case, the entire 15 acres that's available to be developed is going to be used, there's no room for any softening effect. You can soften the impact on the traveling public to some extent with shrubs and so forth, and they're doing that in this instance. But for the neighbors, there's absolutely no mitigation. The upshot of this really is that in spite of the reasonable consideration that the petitioner's witness, Mr. Kane, suggested should be accorded of neighboring properties, or the reasonable outreach that Mr. Busher, the department's witness, said ought to be furnished to by the developer to the neighboring properties in advance of doing the project. Unless those things are going to be reviewed by this board, and if site selection itself is not reviewed by this board, then developers, petitioners will have a free hand to do what they please, and too bad for the neighbors. That does not appear to us to be the Vermont way and the right way. And finally, we complained about the historic sites determination made by the hearing officer. Fundamentally, and I'll say nothing more about this because the exceptions were covered entirely, there's really no record upon which to base his conclusion. He adopts what he says, what he's previously said on the aesthetic issue, as if it pertained to historic sites. Historic sites are a separate and distinct category, and the burden of proof is on the petitioner for all of the criteria in 248B5. So that is the case. All right, thank you. If you have questions, I'd be happy to respond.
Mr. Georgette, one of the things that you mentioned in your argument, you acknowledged the support, granted one paragraph and maybe not dramatically artfully run, supporting renewable resources. But given the fact that that exists inside the language of the plan, how do we find that there was a clear community standard there?
I think the same way that in the Hellman case, the board concluded that the zoning bylaws, for the most part, did not provide guidance. Merely because they address some element of the issue doesn't mean that they really are a basis upon which to form a judgment. I've quoted in my exceptions in brief the language in the town plan respecting renewable energy, and I think you'll see that it's very, very little. It took less than half a page. It took a third of a page or less to quote all of it. So consequently, to say that you're in favor of the American way, you're in favor of renewable energy, that you love apple pie, is all fine.
Don't forget Mom.
That's not criteria upon which to form a judgment as to whether or not the town's position favors this project.
So, when you were describing the goal upon which the neighbors look, I was hearing it as though some mitigation or any mitigation might not have an effect because of the topography. Would, in fact, taller trees?
Well, if it were possible, but as the hearing officer concludes, really without any study, without any information furnished by the petitioner, to quantify and qualify the extent to which any setback would affect the economic integrity of the project. The hearing officer basically concluded that the project would not be economically the same project.
My question is different. It's rather more about the topography and whether trees would make a difference given that it's being looked down upon.
Yeah, you'd have to get the maximum height of trees all around the project from where the houses are situated is 12 feet. That will be maintained. You know, if you could get to 35 or 40 feet, yes, you'd have some impact. And it's 12 feet, not from the road level, but rather from the ground level of the project,
But not from the residents.
which is below the road for the most part.
So the houses can look over the current screening and see the project.
Absolutely.
The only way for the houses to be screened from the project would be for much taller trees.
That's right. And in order to put in much taller trees, they'd have to set back the electric facilities, the panels and so forth, which would reduce their number, which would affect the project. There's no question in my mind that that is true. I don't dispute that. But again, they selected this site. And the board, like the neighbors, apparently is in a position where nobody can do anything about it. Once they've selected a site, no matter whether there can be litigation or not, no matter what the impacts are going to be, we're all stuck with it. You don't make that choice. Certainly the neighbors don't. It's the petitioner that makes that choice, and no one else. Everyone else bows out. I guess I want to say too, when you consider the neighbors participating in a case like this, when you have rules that in effect say that the neighbor's perspective on a project is so special, they can't be considered to be average viewers, you're in effect saying, you shouldn't have gotten into this case to begin with. The honest thing to tell them, probably even in the guidelines for participating in a 248 process, is if you're a neighbor and you intend to come into the case because you're concerned about the aesthetic impacts, understand nobody's going to regard your testimony as relevant, as having any meaning or bearing. You'll be dismissed out of hand because you have a special interest, perspective, and you're not an average viewer. And no one will sit in your position and say, as an average person, I look at this and say it's horrendous and unacceptable. I think to some extent we trick the public into thinking they're going to have meaningful involvement in these proceedings, and I question whether, given the current status of the rules on the aesthetic impact, that is actually true. And I know that that's not your intention. I'm not accusing you of bad faith. I'm saying that effect is a real effect.
So your take on it then is that because they're proximate and it's found that they're not the average person, that in fact they're going to bear the bigger burden and yet they don't get hurt. Is that what you're telling us, Mr. George?
You hear them, but in fact, their testimony is deemed inconsequential. only the traveling public, only people viewing a project from a public area, given the recent board decisions, have standing to complain about the aesthetics. The neighbors really don't. They think they do. They come into the case believing that that's an important criterion and one that pertains specifically to them and that they'll be heard. And given the way these rules are working, they're not heard. They're ignored.
Mr. Brown?
Thank you. I guess at the outset, I do want to zip right quickly into the setback issue with the kilowatt, megawatt. That it's actually a typo that nobody caught. It should be megawatt. It was 0.5 kilowatt would make 0 sense, but in the previous drafts it was always megawatt. It's somehow in that final standard it got to be kilowatt. Planning Commission done. The solar facility siting standards, the setback, the tiered setback approaches. The hearing officer correctly points out that well, kilowatt doesn't make sense, and because of that, I think sort of throws the baby out with the bathwater. But that's what the document does say. That it's not intentional. It's a typo. We can actually get an affidavit in to back that up if need be. But the Planning Commission always worked with those tiered standards as megawatt, not kilowatt. It's just a bad abbreviation. And after they kept going, they always had that. Just I don't know how it happened, but it got in there. But the intent was to have it tiered, going up by half megawatt levels and increasing by 50-foot increments. So if you change the K to an M, that's what the town intended. But so the document in the record is flawed in that respect. But I want to not regurgitate the briefing here and want to maybe sort of step back and look at this at a case at a somewhat higher level. I think it's really a watershed case in a lot of ways. And I think there's just no way to slice it otherwise. This is really a case about whether the board's going to imbue with real meaning what due consideration means. And I think these issues are coming to a head for a couple of reasons. One, we have legislative goals to really increase renewable resource energy production in the state. Those are laudable goals. Section 248 is designed for all kinds of projects, some of which are small, localized ones like this, but also gas pipelines and repair facilities, and talks about regions and such. And the jurisprudence of the case law isn't applied well, or doesn't fit well these kinds of cases. And Alan has highlighted some of those instances, and I think it's really true that there's a perception, and coming from Madison County, there's a lot going on. There's a perception that's growing, whether it's it's not the Public Service Board's design, but there's a perception that's growing, I think, that local communities aren't being heard. And it's the way the rules are applied, because they were developed for other purposes. The Queechy analysis, applied in a traditional sense, doesn't fit very well these kinds of projects, because they're not going to have regional in the sense of the word that a power line does, or a gas pipeline does. It's not going to have a regional impact. So what's the region when you have a solar farm? The region ought to have something to do with the actual kind of project. So what's happened? The board knows well that the legislature has imposed aggressive goals on renewables. We don't quibble with that. And those are fairly recent. The reality is that the vast majority of existing town plans say things about renewables that they always said. Renewables are great. We're in favor of renewable energy. We're in favor of open space. We're in favor of this. We're in favor of that. It's not particularly helpful to this board or to the Act 250 Commission when they take town plans and then look to them. You're supposed to look to them for some sort of guidance, and then they're so broadly worded that the Supreme Court tells us, well, that's not enough to guide the decision makers.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Couldn't the town plan easily, though, say, we're in favor of renewable resources and renewable generation of power, provided they meet certain criteria, and we look forward toward involving those and integrating those into aesthetic. I mean, isn't there ways to do this?
Yes, yeah, I think so, and that's what the solar facility siting standards do. We've got a timing issue here. You know, we have the 2009 town plan. Town plans of that vintage predated the explosive development of solar projects in the state. The town of Rutland, like many communities, particularly in Madison County, are now experiencing, hey, wow, we've got a lot of development here, and realizing, coming to the realization that these projects, though the goals are worthy, have real impacts that must be dealt with, and are in conflict with other laudable goals of the state of Vermont and of the towns. Open space preservation. Every town plan says, good gosh, we want to preserve open space. We love our working landscape in Vermont. All those are true. And now, sometimes these laudable goals come into conflict. And that's what we've got here. So the town of Rutland, through its planning commission and its select board, saw this train coming. Maybe a little bit late, but I don't think so, because prior to the last year or two, renewable energy was really an abstract concept. There was a windmill here or there, or a solar farm here or there, but now they're a real reality, and that's what's happening on the ground now. So I would predict you're going to see a lot more of these cases as towns struggle to adopt specific standards that do exactly what you've suggested. This case doesn't have that. We're in the fourth year of a town plan, but the town did step up and do the best it could do under the circumstances to get something on the books that puts the town's viewpoint on record and for the applicant on record. Here's what we think ought to happen with solar standards. So the other point on town plans is when you look at 248B1, it doesn't limit community standards, written community standards, nor does the Queechy analysis, to town plans. That's typically where we see them in Section 248 proceedings or in Act 250 proceedings, but the solar facility siting standards qualify as a written standard as well. And there, I think there are land conservation measure. So we've got the select board and the planning commission of the town of Rutland coming forward here to say, yes, to its solar siting standards, yes, we like solar. We're not against solar power. We're not trying to bar it. This isn't exclusionary zoning or attempts at zoning. It's fine. It's just got to be in the right place and not conflict with some of the other important proposals. The tiered setback approach was an attempt to soften impact of a proposed project on the surrounding neighbors, the adjoining property owners. Doesn't bar anything, just makes a bigger project stay back further for, I think, fairly obvious and practical reasons. But I guess we could quibble about whether those levels are the right levels, and but I think it was a reasonable and measured attempt through the siting standards to health, soften impact, and integrate these projects into the surrounding properties. And that's what local government is concerned about and ought to be concerned about. But I'd really like to draw the board's attention here to the prime agricultural soil issue in this case. The protection of prime ag soils is something that's in the town plan, even in 2009, has been for a long time. Rutland Town was a farming town. There's still a lot of open space. They passionately love their farming heritage and want to preserve it. It's struggled, as all dairy farming communities have struggled in recent decades, but now it's coming back. It's coming back because of the local food movement and the artisanal farming food product movement, but it's coming back, and I'm not making it up. The Planning Commission in the 2009 plan references that, says, boy, agriculture is really important, and it's coming back. It's on an upswing, and a number of farms is on an upswing, and we really want that to continue. So because of that, it discouraged development on prime ag soils. The solar facility siting standards come along in 2013. Yes, they are specific, but they're responding, specific to solar, because they're responding to a perceived need. In fact, I'll be blunt, a threat to prime ag soils, because projects such as this gravitate toward open space, relatively level open space. And that's often good agricultural land. So the select board, with the planning commission's involvement, the planning commission developed these solar facility siting standards and got them to the select board. So both bodies were involved in their development. And what the new document, 2013 document, says is, well, on agricultural land, which is broader than prime ag land, solar projects, and importantly, ground-mounted solar projects. This isn't anti-solar. It's directed at arrays. If you want to put them on buildings, the town thinks that's great. Put them on top of the Diamond Run Mall, fantastic. But ground-mounted solar arrays should be at the edge of open fields along the fringe to avoid the border between woodland, to avoid fragmentation, keep open land, open ag land open. The clear objective of the solar facility siting standards is to maintain the availability of the land for agricultural use. True, this land hadn't been farmed recently, but there are farms around it, and there have been negotiations to sell it to farmers before. It could come back. Now, the town standards, go further and actually prohibit the location of ground-mounted solar arrays on prime ag soils, because it recognizes, both in 2009 and in 2013, that prime ag soils are a limited resource, a scarce, fragile, precious resource in the town. So the town isn't barring solar or even ground-mounted solar arrays. It says don't put them on prime ag soils. So what does that mean? Does that mean that there aren't going to be ground-mounted solar arrays in Rutland? No. Only 22% of the land. I don't know how that compares to other towns. I think it's probably less than towns in Addison County, more than the Northeast Kingdom. But 22% of the land in Rutland County is prime ag soil, which means 78% is not. 78% of the land, a lot of which is open, is available to projects just like this. But this particular site is not, because it's all prime ag. All 15 acres, every array is going to be sitting on top of prime ag soils.
A question, does the town contemplate also restricting residential development on prime ag soils?
I think it does in the town. I think the way it does it is, but the town plan in 2009, which is broader, discourages it. So what does that mean? I think what it means is the town plan recognizes that there may be some, there inevitably will be some development on prime ag soils, because prime ag soils don't follow district boundaries. They're dispersed throughout the town. They're scattered. So, you know, there might be residential development along the road or something, but the intent is to maintain the big blocks, and maybe if it's back from the road, then okay, fine, you can still develop there. So does it prohibit residential development on prime ag? No. Or any development. It discourages it. But the town in 2013 was responding to this salient, specific need on the ground, right now. You know, it's a hot issue. People want to have some role, want some say, and it's solar. It's not that solar's bad, it's that solar needs to be fitted in. And how are we going to fit it in? So the town acted on solar. Doesn't mean that they won't do more on other things down the road. They probably will, but they zeroed in on solar because they had to. They felt they had to because prime ag soils were at risk. It's a limited resource, and the intent and language of the 2013 standard makes it clear that it's more protective than what the board typically does with prime ag soils when it looks at the Act 250 criteria 9B. That criteria focuses on the agricultural potential. Is there a reduction in the agricultural potential of the soils? I think that's a little bit fictional here. The applicant says, well, it's temporary, so there's no impact, and we take the panels out. But there's nothing that says the panels won't stay there forever. They're saying they have a 20 or 25-year lifespan, and that makes it temporary. But that's just the lifespan of the panels. When they wear out, there can be new ones, and there's nothing in the CPG petition nor in their proposal that says limit me to 20 years or 25. So focusing on the lifespan of a piece of equipment to say it has no impact on the agricultural potential because the equipment might be removed after 25 years it's fictional. I don't think anybody thinks that makes a lot of sense. But it's kind of beside the point, at least in this case, because the town says it's not about agricultural potential. It's that this prime ag land has to be kept open, free from solar arrays, ground-mounted solar arrays, to protect the land, to keep it open for agricultural development.
Even though you could build a house on it that would be permanently there and probably doesn't have a 20-year span, is that?
That's right. Yeah, and I, right, because, well, it's because we're in the midst of a town plan when this case comes along, and solar is the big issue that needed to be addressed, so we zeroed in on solar. Where are we going to put these things? We don't, they're coming fast and furious. People can debate about whether that's good or bad. There's people on both sides of the fence. But in Rutland County, in part because Green Mountain Power is located there, they've really made a big push in Rutland County to make it the solar capital. And the town felt the need to actually specifically address solar. So the fact that with these interim standards that support the town plan, the fact that more comprehensive responses to other things are possible and might happen someday should not detract the board from applying the solar standards. So we've got two clear conflicts here with written community standards that are quite clear. And what's in collision, so we've got the setbacks, which is relevant to aesthetics, and for prime ag soils. This project just can't, the conflict couldn't be clearer with respect to prime ag soils. The judgment of the legislative body of the town and its planning commission is keep that land open, don't put solar arrays on it, because that's exactly the kind of land that these projects are going to go to, and we can't have that. There's other open land, and they can go there, but if it's prime ag, we got to protect it. And that's the judgment of the town, and it's a reasonable judgment. And it's also consistent with lots of public policy in the state of Vermont that comes from the legislature. So you've got all kinds of legislative proposals and statutes and policies from the state of Vermont to preserve farmland, to preserve open space, to protect our rural landscape. It's what part of what makes us special. We've got conservation easements, all sorts of things, historic, or preservation trust, land trust, all these groups are working with legislative support to preserve open space and to preserve the working landscape of Vermont. And that's what the town's doing. So the town's not being a bad guy. The town's come down squarely in favor of protecting prime ag for agricultural use in this case. So now we've got a direct conflict. And I think it may be the first time you've had that. I don't know, but from what I can, for sure, but from what I can gather by looking at past decisions, that direct conflict has been avoided before, hasn't come quite to the head that it's coming to here. Because the town standard wasn't good, wasn't clear enough, or as what is typically the case, you've got conflicting goals. We love open space, we want to preserve our farms, we want renewable energy too, and then what are you supposed to do with that? So that's sort of impossible. Well, now we have the true conflict with the town resolving it clearly on the side of prime ag soils and agricultural use. That's how the towns made their choice. And so now you have to decide, what do you do with that? And I submit that due consideration is to actually mean something, have tangible, real meaning to the localities in which these kinds of projects are truly local. It's going to have real meaning in these types of situations. You can't just, you ought not to just sweep towns written expression of what it wants aside. Because if when you've got a head-on conflict like this in the town, and the municipal standard is reasonably based and supports another clear public policy objective of the state of Vermont, I think you've got to go with the locality, with a local project like this. This isn't this isn't a town standing in the way of a transmission line that spans 6 counties, or a gas pipeline that runs down the Champlain Valley. You've got a local project here with impacts on the surrounding properties, and the town taking a clear position for laudable purposes, and I think you've got to go with them if due consideration means anything.
I see a contradiction between wanting to preserve prime ag soils, which would mean nothing of them, and having setback requirements. So which is the town's priority, setback or?
Well, it's both, and this is how the setback standards for solar, the ground-mounted solar arrays, applies regardless of the type of soil. So that applies throughout the town, and it's only ground-mounted. When you get to prime ag lands, which is a small percentage in the town, then the prime ag soils control. So I think they make sense. One's more general and one's specific. So on this site, the setbacks don't matter because it can't be located at all on the site. The whole site is prime ag. There probably aren't too many 15-acre sites like that, but this one is, and I think there are some problems that have developed now with the jurisprudence of the board, not by it's not machinations of bad design, or it's just that the projects that led to the development of the Queechy analysis and the way Section 248 is written, the way the standards have been applied in other projects doesn't fit very well with these small solar projects that are local. And there's a variety of places where that happens. And you can see it happening, working itself out in the proposal for decision. The municipal plan to be able to give guidance under 248B1 is supposed to be a clear written community standard and the Queechy analysis. It's supposed to be specific enough. Yet, the hearing officer dismisses the town's attempt and successful attempt at writing a clear standard as de facto attempt at de facto zoning, which you can't do because you're trying to tie the board's hands. Well, you can't have it both ways. That's the ultimate catch-22. If you write a general standard, it's not specific enough, and if you write it specific enough, you're stepping on the toes of the board because the board has preeminent authority in 248 proceedings. That's a really bad way to go. It creates the notion that this is a sham. This is a sham proceeding, and nobody wants that. Alan touched upon the notion that as applied, the neighbors, the impact on the adjoining properties doesn't count because they're too interested to be considered the impact on the public. And again, when it's a local project, I don't think that gives people a real voice. The analysis that the board has used in some cases to assess public impact, since we put to the side the adjoining property owners as being too interested, now we look at it's the public, and how does the public experience this property? Well, it's the driving public. So I know the New Haven case, you see a recitation in the record of, well, at Route 7 is 50 miles an hour, so you see it for however many seconds. One sees it at 50 miles an hour, and that's ephemeral. As far as the public's concerned, that's just such a minor thing, it doesn't count. But the project's there all the time, and everybody's seeing it, even if it's each person on that particular moment is a relatively brief time period. So to just focus on the passing by of the motorist at speed as the measure for public impact, I think is wrong-headed, frankly. The testimony in this case, apparently fairly typical for proceedings before the Public Service Board, with the assessment by the experts that it will not have an adverse impact on the public. The public will not perceive it as being out of place. The experts are allowed to just simply say so, based on what they're thinking. I encourage you to read the testimony, the cross-exam of the applicant's expert on that. I asked him, Mr. Kane, what the basis for his conclusion was. There'd be no impact. The public would not perceive it as out of place. Well, he said it's an objective standard, and I get that. So how work me through what's the basis for a conclusion that it wouldn't have an impact? He said, well, I think about it objectively, and I concluded that the project would not offend the sensibilities of the public. Well, there's got to be more than that. It can't just be some person saying, I'm a planner, I'm an expert, or I thought about it objectively and I concluded that it doesn't have an adverse impact in the public's eye. There are ways to substantiate whether it would or wouldn't. We have photographs, enhanced photographs, evidence before the board of what this project will look like from the neighbors' viewpoints once the landscaping has grown. Those things could be shown. There could be surveys to people to get a reaction. None of that's done. To render an opinion about how the public would react needs to have more. The board ought to require more than it's typically required. There needs to be some basis, and there is no basis in this case. And this case, as far as I can tell, is not unique in that respect. I think correction is warranted there. This case is really important to the town, but also I think to the board and to renewable energy development, because the public needs to see that they have a meaningful voice. And this is, I think, the first time when a municipality has really stepped up with clear position based on Vermont public policy goals and local public policy goals that are well recognized and respected. And it's too bad to say, but it's true that this project on this site should not get a CPG. There's plenty of places in the town of Rutland where there are 15 acres where this project could go. It just can't go here. I'm done.
Department doesn't have anything above and beyond what's filed in response.
Okay, and Mr. Reinhardt, you didn't file a response?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hayes?
Thank you. We did file retail comments. We filed a proposal for the second reply brief and comments, and I'm not going to repeat all of those, just respond to a few of the comments that came in already. And I'll start with Mr. Brown. He raised the specter of, what does due consideration mean? The Vermont Supreme Court in 1975, in a seminal case of Ray Vermont Electric Power Company, stated that the legislature's use of the phrase due consideration in section 248B1 at least impliedly postulates that municipal enactments in a specific area are advisory rather than controlling. Absent a clear, explicit legislative pronouncement, the power to subvert utility projects statewide in scope and broadly entrusted to a single planning and is broadly entrusted to a single planning and supervisory agency, that being the Public Service Board. In fact, any attempt at municipal regulation is preempted. And that's what the Supreme Court said with respect to 248B1. And in the Georgia Mountain case in docket 7508, and we quoted this, the board concluded that the same due consideration applied with respect to section 248B5. I would submit that this project is due consideration applied with respect to section 248B5. I would submit that this project is part of a statewide program. It's part of the SPEED program, and the board has consistently applied the due consideration standard in other dockets, numerous other dockets, consistent with the hearing officer's proposal for decision. Excuse me, I'm cold. Concerning the prime ag soils position of the town, this particular site is located in an industrial commercial zone that the town itself has designated as part of being an industrial commercial zone. It has not been farmed in over 18 years. That was the testimony of Mr. Hubbard, who testified on behalf of the town, and it's finding 208 of our brief. The town also is very clear from the evidence of the record, and we cited this in our findings, that the so-called supporting plan, the siting standards, were not duly adopted as part of the town plan, and in fact, they were still under revision when we were in technical hearings. I question what municipal enactment at all these standards constitute, but at the end of the day, the board only need to give due consideration to those standards. Under the Queechee test, and we've briefed this, but to constitute a clear community standard, the standard must be intended to preserve the area, aesthetics, or scenic beauty of the area where the project is to be located. So it can't just be a generic statement with setbacks. There was nothing in the town siting standards that identified this particular project site as being aesthetically important or intending to preserve the scenic beauty of this area. Finally, and I think this is the board has done this since, to my recollection, the Northwest Reliability Project case. The board has been very clear that under the Queechee analysis, its assessment of project impacts is significantly informed by the overall societal benefits of the project. That's something that neither the town nor the neighbors have addressed. We have briefed that. There are clear policy greenhouse gas reduction goals that this project will help the state to achieve. One final comment. There's been a lot of discussion about the neighbors and this project being shocking and offensive. I would point out, and I would ask the board to review Ms. Vissering's report, which is JB2. She was the expert for the neighbors. Her own conclusion is that this project is not shocking and offensive, as well as the conclusion of both Mr. Busher for the department and Mr. King for the petitioner.
Ms. Hayden, let me ask you then, let's go to part of the heart of what I think Mr. Brown and Mr. George were arguing about. That might be true if you're taking the average person who's driving by for a short period of time and is going to have a minimal period of time going by it, but that we don't look at the issue of what about people, maybe a substantial number, who are going to look at this over and over and over again, day after day after day, but they're not the average person, so we don't count. How do you react to that argument?
Well, I think that this is an issue of, how do you deal with development generally? The town doesn't have the authority to zone and set setback standards. If a commercial housing development or some other commercial development were erected in that lot, these landowners would be faced with the very same situation and probably something, I'm guessing, but that would be, in my opinion, dramatically more aesthetically impactful. This project will be in place for 25 years. It will be fully decommissioned at the end of its useful life. The agricultural soils will be restored, which is one of the reasons why the Ag Department isn't party to the docket. We've worked through restoration plans for ag soils. All of the infrastructure will be removed when the project is decommissioned. There was testimony in the proceeding about, these landowners that are adjacent to the project site will have a view of the site during, the next 25 years. Well, that's true. These landowners also have the ability to work with their local representatives and undertake perhaps a redesignation of this site as a commercial industrial. Mr. Vien's testimony was submitted in the docket was that one of the reasons this location was chosen was because of its designation as a commercial industrial site. Most of the neighbors are rather distant views. There are several right across the street, but it's an open meadow. It's been for sale for a long time, and the environmental impacts are relatively negligible. They've been mitigated. The larger site is more than 15 acres. It's around 30, and the project has already been shrunk and remodified to deal with wetland impacts. So, I think I've permitted a lot of these projects, and you run into different issues with each site. These projects are not invisible, that's for sure. But this is a good location.
Okay, we've concluded our oral argument. I want to thank everybody.
Maybe we make just a couple of comments.
Sure.
In response to what Ms. Hayden just said. First, she indicated that that their project is part of a statewide program. She's not able to say it's part of a statewide project, so the quotation from the decision she referenced, the Supreme Court decision on due consideration, really pertains specifically to statewide projects. Secondly, she addressed the question of societal benefits. I don't have a citation off the top of my head, but I think it's the Belco and GMP case decided by this board just a couple of years ago, in which it was made clear that societal benefits do include aesthetics and issues of that nature, as well as the economic benefits. And finally, she said, I think that the project is about the whole project property is about 30 acres, and I think on the record at least it's 24. I don't mean to quibble.
This isn't testimony, so.
I understand. Yeah.
Any statements by any of you is not evidence, and it won't have anything taken that way.
And I'm not seeking to address everything that she said. I just wanted to make a couple of points that I thought
Okay.
were relevant.
Yep.
I have a question before you go on, this related to what you just said and to what Ms. Hagan said. Originally, you said that all 15 acres are consumed by the panels, and yet now I'm hearing that there are still acres, I mean, which is right?
There's additional acreage, which is wetland, class 2
Oh, right,
wetland.
okay.
Yeah.
And so it's apparently, your information is it's a 24-acre site, 15 of which is being used by the town?
Yes, and the balance is wetland.
So it's Rutland City, 9 acres, and 15 acres in Rutland Town, roughly, is that what we're talking about?
No, it's all Rutland Town. It's all Rutland
Some
Town.
of it is not buildable.
Okay, I got you.
Correct. Correct. I just have one.
Sure, and also if you would just address, since it's zoned commercial industrial,
It's not.
We have no
It's
zoning.
not, there's no zoning.
okay.
It's
since
in the town
What was
plan.
your comment about it?
I use the word designated.
Oh, designated.
Designated in the
Okay.
town
In
plan.
a future land use plan,
Okay,
it is so designated.
okay.
But a future land use plan is a compulsory plan, as we point out in our sections in brief, that all towns are required to have. This one was developed in 2009. The future land use map is 2004. The legend on it indicates that it's inaccurate and incomplete.
There was evidence on this in the record, and Mr. George is testifying. I don't think.
No, I'm
But
just
he's
indicating
not,
what it
because
is.
this isn't testimony.
No,
And
that's,
so, to the extent he's being inaccurate, that's his own, that's a problem that he's gonna have for how much credibility we give his statement.
that might be Mr. George's way of getting us to actually go read every word of the records.
Yes. Yeah, the whole exhibit would be pertinent, I'm sure.
I think he's convinced.
But I mean, if you're a developer looking to locate a project, doesn't it make sense to put a project like this in an area designated as commercial and industrial? And what else would you expect to be proposed for that site if not something like this? And how would the neighbors like whatever it is that's proposed? I'm asking Mr. Brown.
Well, my response to that is the land use districts have been around a long time and haven't been adapted. But you'll see within the plan, which is in the record, and when it talks about the land use district, and specifically the industrial commercial area, it talks about that have services and are close to main thoroughfares, have access, and that there is a development called Quality Lane on Cold River Road, runs north-south, then turns west to go to Route 7. And so between the Diamond Run Mall and Route 7, and where the Cold River Road turns is an industrial park on the other side of the wetland. And so, way back, when the land use districts were first contemplated and drawn up, the thinking was, well, there might be water and sewer, there might be, these might be areas where infrastructure is extended, and if the infrastructure's there, these are the good places. Well, the infrastructure stops at Quality Lane and has stopped there for a long time. But more specifically to the question of isn't this a good site, you got to look at the whole picture. I'm not aware of any town plan or zoning map that draws boundaries based on primatic soils, because these things appear all over the place in every town. They're a natural phenomena, and so you're going to have to read it together. We've got this big district this big area between Cold River Road and Route 7 is indeed in a future land use district called industrial commercial. It's not all prime ag by any stretch, but this little corner of it is. In the town plan, even in 2009, said, hey, we discourage development in open ag areas and want it to be on the fringe to avoid fragmentation. So you've got to have it. You've got to read it all together. can't just look at the district, and I don't think any developer does, looks at the district and say, I'm golden. And the solar facility siting standards were out. Mr. Gansel was at the hearings. He knew what they said. And that was before the petition was filed. There was no attempt to amend the proposal, even to abide by the setbacks. They didn't try to make it fit. So when they first looked at the project site, yeah, were the solar facility siting standards in place? No, probably not. When they were developed, was he in the room? Yeah, he was. He knew what they said, and they filed the petition in early December. The facility siting standards were set in October 22nd. So my last comment is I'm not sure. I don't think you and I are in disagreement about the impact of the solar facility siting standards. Town understands that the Public Service Board has complete authority in these matters. The Supreme Court's been clear. That's what due consideration means. No one's questioning that. It's what we're talking about is what does that really mean on the ground? You've got to look at the standards, and if they're legitimately drawn and drawn for the right purpose, or a purpose that is well recognized, rather than just exclusionary zoning, trying to get it out of town, prohibiting these things, zone it out of existence in town. That's not what we've got here. So no locality can tie the PSB's hands. We understand that. But when you've got a clear standard that's legitimate and public policy based, and it's in direct conflict with a particular proposal, we submit that you ought to tip the scales in favor of the locality for a local project such as this. That's all.
Mr. George, is there?
No, thank
Mr. Einhorn, I have a question for you. You've been quiet, you haven't said anything, you didn't participate, you didn't put comments in. But that's kind of my question. Implicit in Mr. Brown's argument, and to some degree Mr. George's argument back and forth, was the issue of prime agricultural soil. And it doesn't appear that there's any question about the fact that at least part of this probably is. Why was it that A&R took no position?
That's a topic we typically do not address. In the past, my experience is the ag agency has been involved in some of these cases, and they've participated on that issue. To my knowledge, we've never participated on the agricultural soil issue. On forests, say natural communities, wildlife habitat, and actually some of those issues were involved here, wildlife habitat. There are conditions that are memorialized in the MOU, but it has not been our practice to participate on the agricultural soil issue to date.
Thank you.
Mr. Brook, if I may, I believe that Massimo's from the Agency of Agriculture did come to the pre-hearing conference and said that the agency didn't have a concern.
I'm going to correct that. If the board looks at the pleadings, the attorney for the ag department said resources are short, staffing is short, we've got a lot of irons in the fire, and we've made our concerns known to the board in the past, and we think the board understands them, so we're not going to participate on prime ags anymore. And so it was a policy-based decision. She withdrew her notice of representation and explained to the board why she was doing it. It had nothing to do with this project. It was just a policy-based decision that they've got. She thinks you folks have got religion from them on the prime ag issue. And
Either that or we're hopeless case.
One or the other.
One or the other. But it's in writing, and she explained.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. I want to thank everybody. This concludes your life.
you.